on Paternoster Square. And this will be happening, I'm very happy to say, soon after Easter. And we'll be announcing the exciting event plans very soon. I'm pleased to say that we're going to continue live streaming of talks to ensure that they're fully accessible. So Temple Bar, architectural gateway to the city, designed by Sir Christopher Wren and managed by the Trust, is also home to our associated Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects, of which I am a liveryman. Well, that should really be livery person, of course. And we really look forward to activating the space for in-person events and meetings, dining and entertainment. And you will have also the opportunity to book our centre for your own events as well. So this evening, I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, Owen Hopkins, writer, curator, architectural historian, and director of the Farrell Centre at Newcastle University. Hello, Owen, it's really very good to have you with us.
Hi.
Hi, yeah. So let me just quickly say exactly what it is and give a brief introduction to you biographically. So the groundbreaking new public centre for architecture in cities, it's due to open later in 2022. It will be part research hub, civic space, gallery museum with space for fledgling architecture and other creative industries, businesses. So it responds to the idea of Sir Terry Farrell, published in the Farrell Review of 2014, that all cities should have urban rooms where everyone could be creatively engaged in the future of architecture and the wider making of urban spaces, which all sounds like a pretty amazing remit that you've got, Owen. So Sir Terry donated £1 million from his great archive, including a number of his projects in Newcastle, to the university 3 years ago. He, at the time, I think when Owen was appointed, he said he was just the right fit for the director job. So let me give you a few bio details about him. So Owen took on the role of director after working as senior curator of exhibitions and education at Sir John Soane's Museum in London. And before that, architecture programme director at the Royal Academy of Arts. He's curated several exhibitions, including most recently Langlands and Bell, Degrees of Truth, Eric Parry, drawing The Return of the Past, Postmodernism in British Architecture, and Origins, a project by Ordinary Architecture. So he's author of 7 books, most recently The Museum, From Its Origins to the 21st Century, published last year, Postmodern Architecture, Less is a Bore, Phaidon, 2 years ago, Lost Futures, The Disappearing Architecture of Post-War Britain, Mavericks, Breaking the Mold of British Architecture, another one for the RA publications, and From the Shadows, The Architecture and Afterlife of Nicholas Hawksmoor, and Reading Architecture, a visual lexicon which has been translated into 11 languages. So he's written widely on architecture for titles including The Independent, CNN, Dezeen, Domus, Icon, The Architectural Review, Blueprint, Architecture Today, The Architect's Newspaper Topos, and The Architect's Journal, and lectured internationally at institutions including Yale School of Architecture, University of Oxford, Viscaya Museum and Garden, Miami, and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And he's a regular guest critic at a number of architectural schools, has judged many awards, and appeared on BBC Two Newsnight, BBC Look North, Arte, the European Culture TV channel, BBC Radio 3, BBC Radio London, and Monocle Radio. So a pretty connected guy. So we're really looking forward to your talk, Owen, and please put your questions, if you have them, to Owen in the chat box, and we'll engage with them a little bit later after his talk. So over to you, Owen. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks for inviting me and for the very kind introduction. It's really great to be talking about the Farrell Centre and the process of creating it, the considerations, as we'll see, practical and philosophical, that have shaped that process. We actually opened in early 2023. I think we slipped slightly between announcing a 2022 date and the reality of our building project, but we are still on schedule. And as you can imagine, probably about a year out, many of our programs are still in development and some are still under wraps. So I can't reveal everything, but hopefully can still give a flavour of our aspirations for the project. Now, as Lucy's already described, the origins of the project revolve around Sir Terry Farrell. And the first sort of foundational strand is, again, as Lucy's mentioned, the Farrell Review, the review commissioned by the coalition government into the country's architecture and built environment, which Terry led. This was published in 2014 under the title Our Future in Place. And the review made a number of recommendations focused on increasing public engagement in architecture and planning. And among these was the idea that, quote, every town and city should have an urban room where the past, present, and future of that place can be inspected. And for Terry, the urban room would be a critical part of reversing what he identified in the review as a lack of public engagement in urban change in the UK. So this really kind of provided the backdrop, and the sort of the impetus for the establishing of the centre came, again, as Lucy mentioned, in 2018, when Terry generously donated his professional archive to Newcastle University as a resource for study and public engagement. I was in the archive earlier this week, and these are a few snapshots of probably some quite familiar projects from Terry's career. He has long-standing connections to Newcastle. He grew up in the north of the city. He studied at Newcastle University in the 1990s. He created a master plan for the regeneration of the quayside, an incredibly successful master plan. And in the 2000s for the university's campus and has completed buildings in the city. So it was the gift of the archive combined with the backdrop of the Farrell Review that really spurred the creation of the Farrell Centre as an urban room for Newcastle, or rather Tyneside, the Tyneside Conurbation, which along with the city of Newcastle, as you can see on my the map there, includes Gateshead and then stretches along the banks of the Tyne to the coastal areas to the north and south. It's the seventh largest conurbation in the UK. It's home to around 750,000 people. So I came aboard as director of the Farrell Centre in November 2019. And at that point, a building had been identified to house the centre on campus. The Claremont building on the edge of the campus. And for those of you who know the city, it's on the corner of Barras Bridge and Claremont Road, directly opposite the Civic Centre. This is a deliberately uninspiring photo I took last year, I think, while during one of the lockdowns, some work was taking place to redo the pavement. This building was constructed in the 1890s as a department store and workshop, and it's a strange survivor in a way, because of the considerable changes that took place in this part of the city in the 1960s, not least the creation of the Civic Centre, the university's Daish building, and of course the nearby Central Motorway. And this building has had various uses since that time. It was used for the university chaplaincy. There was a doctor's surgery in it. Terry himself remembers using one of the top floor rooms as studio spaces while he was a student. But latterly, it's fallen out of use, and with the exception of the cafe that occupies part of the ground floor, you can see those red blinds indicate where that is. The building is in sort of considerable disrepair. So the building project was first and foremost about making these essential repairs and then adapting the building for of future use as the Farrell Centre, all while working around it being Grade 2 listed. So when I started the job, the technical side of the building project was already pretty well advanced, but the program side was less developed. So I really had to get up to speed quite quickly with thinking hard about how the spaces would be used. And in turn, I suppose, really figuring out what the centre would be and what it would do, because there were lots of ideas that had been discussed from the very beginning. And of course, there's a sort of foundational concept of the urban room, but it was all still relatively open. So I had to make quite quick progress to catch up with the building project, but then obviously everything jutted to a halt when the pandemic hit and the university, like many others, suspended non-essential expenditure, and this naturally included capital projects. And this was a mixed blessing in a way. It was obviously disappointing and frustrating that the project had paused, but it also gave a little bit of breathing space to take a step back and to do some conceptual work about what precisely it was we were trying to achieve with the Farrell Centre and how we might go about doing it. Now, the urban room concept really was central to this. The Farrell Review, I think very helpfully, doesn't really get into specifics, but it does include this concept drawing showing how the urban room brings together exhibition, learning, and community spaces, all revolving interestingly around a city model. And in this, it recalls mid-20th century planning exhibitions, which are conceived to promote community discussion, usually around specific development projects. And more recently, of course, there are a range of international parallels from the Shanghai Urban Planning Exhibition Centre, a 6-story museum-like institution founded in 2000 and arranged around this extraordinary city model, to something closer to home, LiveWorks in Sheffield, which is an exhibition and event space located, as you can probably see, in a former retail space in the heart of the city. So while retaining this sort of emphasis on urban form that was very pronounced in the Shanghai Urban Planning Exhibition Centre, the Farrell Centre urban room conception draws heavily on the sort of bottom-up approach, enabling an almost sort of activist mission to engaging the public in architecture and planning, and I'll explore that a little bit further shortly. But there's no specific recipe or blueprint for what an urban room might be, which I think is interesting in itself. And each example is different. And rather than think of the urban room as a single thing or a formula that might be applied, began to see it as something that was defined by a kind of hybridity. An urban room is many things simultaneously. And it's a deliberately loose concept that I saw as being given a specificity by its application to a particular city or region. And so we conceive the Farrell Centre as a civic space, as a museum, and a research hub, a place where we run exhibitions, stage talks and debates, organise workshops for schools, young people, or community groups, where we make publications, we might commission projects, and we offer workspace for startup companies. And I think it's important to state the urban room, despite the name, is not a particular space or room within the centre, but more a holistic concept that connects all aspects of our programme and really is the kind of the glue between our audience and the programme. So this idea that the urban room is given specificity when it's applied obviously extends to the building in which the institution to which it emerges is housed. And this is an early concept image or drawing produced by the practices who are working on it. It's a collaboration between space architects and Elliott architects, both local. And they explored, I guess in quite a sort of simplistic way, but this sort of hybridity, but in, I think, quite a compelling one. And essentially what they suggested was to kind of split each attribute through the building, to give it each one its own floor. And what this has has allowed is, it's kind of shifted a bit from this, but the sort of fundamental concepts of giving each floor over to a specific or a particular use has very much remained. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'll take you on a little bit of a journey through the building, and in each space talk about how we're going to use it as a way of really kind of bringing to life some of the principles that inform and underpin the work that we're going to be doing. And it starts before the building, in fact, as you can see here. The centre sits adjacent to a sort of vestigial street, Eldon Place, and you can hopefully kind of make it out in this image. At the moment, and I don't have a photograph of its current state, I'm afraid, but it's used for bicycles, for overflow car parking. It's very kind of cluttered. And our intention is really to sweep it away and leave it as one uncluttered surface. It's sort of, I mean, in some ways, this is a slightly ridiculous comparison, vastly smaller, but there's a kind of echo here of the aspirations behind the public space in front of the Pompidou Centre. It's a kind of blank canvas to facilitate urban interactions. And it's a space that we will program in different ways. We will have activities from inside the centre spilling out in the summer. We'll have cafe seating. We will certainly be fighting the weather, I would imagine, but I'm kind of optimistic here about the potential for this space to help blur the distinctions between a cultural institution and all the connotations that they have and the surrounding city. And this is really one of the kind of key aspirations for the project. It's the idea of sort of breaking down the barrier between city and cultural institution really extends into the interior as well. And one of the first moves, which is actually not shown in this image, I should point out before someone does, is that we got rid of the large reception desk that had been imagined to kind of, considerably fill this space. And we're not going to have a reception desk at all, because I think, in my view, while they are quite useful, they, from a sort of practical operational point of view, they risk creating too much of an institutional feel and a kind of a barrier, a threshold, a gateway you have to cross. And we want people to wander into the centre in the way they might wander into a shop. And there is a kind of consciously almost sort of retail-y feel to this, with this contemporary frontage that's inserted into the historic fabric. We want to create an openness and also a sense of arrival. And you also see another distinctive part of this space is the way we've worked hard to create the view from Eldon Place to Claremont Road, the other side. So we kind of think of this as almost a kind of urban intervention. We're kind of creating a connection between the public space of the street that kind of incidentally passes through the centre. And all of this is harder to pull off in practice, of course, but that's really the ethos that we're trying to establish here. The main spatial interventions in that entranceway are the circulation stair, which you can see quite clearly in the left, and then you can see here again in this section, and the sunken seating. Now, as an architectural gesture, it's a familiar one, that's for sure. Sort of these sort of stairs come lecture hall seating has become, a kind of recurring feature of how these types of circulation spaces are treated in museums, particularly, and also in university buildings. That an attempt to kind of break down the sort of institutional feel of these places. And that is certainly some part of the way we're using it here. But it does a couple of things which are particular to this space, I think. It has an important sort of volumetric function. It extends the height of the room at the far end or the near end, depending on which way you're approaching. So it becomes almost double height. So it makes the space feel bigger. It creates a kind of greater sense of expanse and that one has arrived somewhere. And I think also important is that while this is a kind of a familiar sort of architectural gesture, as I described, it's not actually part of the circulation. space here. So it is probably more functional for someone just to come and sit here, do a bit of work, to meet someone, than it is if you're sat on some stairs and you constantly have people walking past you. And it's somewhere that we hope will just be somewhere just for people to just come and use. But we also plan to use it for informal lunchtime talks or orientation for school visits, for instance. And I think, following from that, there's this idea that cultural institutions have to own their programs. But I think what we want to establish here is a kind of a framework for the Farrell Centre to act as a kind of a platform for other groups whose missions intersect with our own. So we're not kind of monopolizing what we do. A kind of fundamental tenet of it is to open our doors and allow our spaces to be used by others. And this spirit continues upstairs in the space that's directly above the entrance hall, and you can see it on the left-hand side. You can see the stair continuing up. Now, I'm afraid this is a very kind of quite schematic view, a simple general arrangement, but we're not yet in a position to reveal anything further about how these spaces are going to be fitted out. So you just kind of have to rely on my description at this point. But similarly, this space will be left open, unprogrammed, but with the addition at the bottom of built-in furniture, where again, it's open to anyone as a place for somewhere to come and sit, to meet people, to work, to read, or just to pause, all without being pressured into buying a coffee or buying something from the gift shop. And I think that kind of space is certainly rare in museums. And I think it's certainly rare in cities more generally. We see it as a kind of a public space as one that happens to be inside. And this very much kind of sums up the idea that the Farrell Centre is conceived. I've talked about kind of museum. It's kind of museum-like qualities, but at the same time, fundamental to our mission is to attract people who would never think of coming to a museum or would never think that these are places that are for them. We want the Farrell Centre to be somewhere where everyone is, but also everyone feels welcome. And ultimately, this comes down to this sort of mission of engaging the public with architecture and planning, and the idea that we can't properly affect any kind of meaningful change if we only reach or only involve a subset of the public. To be a truly public institution, our audience needs to be reflective of the public as a whole. And this extends to our, I've preempted the slide, to our exhibitions. So these, our exhibition galleries are these 4 rooms. I don't know, you can probably just make out, it's an exhibition space 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's just under 150 square meters, so it's not big by any means, but it's certainly big enough to do something meaningful. And in a way, these are our exhibition program. Is going to be our highest profile program, and it's going to be the generator for lots of other activities. But at the same time, I'm keen that we don't inscribe a kind of a hierarchy into our programs. This is usually the case at other institutions whose programs are part of their revenue generation, where revenue generating programs suck up all the institutional attention, both internally and how they're presented externally, to the detriment of programs that are maybe not revenue generating, but are just as important to the mission. So what we want to do is present a kind of a parity between the different programs that we do, whether it's an exhibition, a podcast, an opinion piece, an image gallery, an event, a roundtable, really kind of blurring the things that take place live, in person, and things that exist online. So we don't want to value one type of experience because it generates income over another. And as I say, this is kind of reflected in our website and the explore function that we have, where everything is presented in a way that is explicitly non-hierarchical. We don't yet have the full range of programs because it's still early days, but this will be the home for all the types of things that I've just mentioned. And part of it is to give that impression of the full range of programs that we offer. As for the exhibitions themselves, this is a rendering just to kind of give a very loose impression of how these spaces might be used as galleries. The animating idea that underpins all the exhibitions that we'll do is to connect the local to the global and vice versa. And this means putting on shows that are situated and are meaningful in the city, in the region, but connect to ideas, issues, and concerns of global relevance and significance. And I always think the risk of focusing solely on the local is of becoming sort of parochial, introspective, and losing a kind of perspective, where if one only focuses on the global, it all becomes a bit untethered and abstract. So the aspiration is to connect these two, the local and the global, through our exhibitions, and this governs both the themes and ideas that we explore through them, and also the way they are curated. A particular challenge of these galleries, as observers of these images may have already clocked, is that they have these floor-to-ceiling windows around the perimeter walls, and they have a relative lack of wall space. So they're a challenge curatorially, but I think a useful one at the same time, for forcing us to look beyond typical or familiar means of displaying or even selecting objects. So I think the result will be three-dimensional material will be fundamental to how we to what we display in these spaces, although not necessarily the sole focus. But I'm interested in what the opportunities that these windows have in other ways. So seeing them less as a challenge, but as something that is distinctive to these spaces and to our programs, because they connect what's going on inside the centre and what's going on in the exhibition galleries to the city outside in a really direct way. So rather than taking place in the kind of, the traditional hermetically sealed, consciously decontextualized container, the city will always be present. And so therefore will be a kind of constant implicit or explicit referent for our exhibitions. And it goes the other way as well. Our exhibitions will be, I think, uniquely visible from the surrounding city. So the way that we will have to curate them is both for visitors in the galleries, but also with an appreciation for those who are looking from the outside. And in a kind of very practical sense, this means we don't need large or expensive banners that we drape all over the building to advertise what's going on, because in effect, the exhibitions themselves will become their own billboards. So it's a challenge to conventional curatorial practice, but I think a huge opportunity as well. So reaching and you can just see in this render how pronounced those windows are as part of the building's sort of exterior expression. So we reach the second floor, and here, and again, I'm afraid, very schematic view of this floor. But here the shift is from being focused on display to debate, discussion, and interaction. And these rooms, as you can see, follow the footprint of those below, but they have much lower ceilings, smaller windows, and have a more domestic feel. And these will be the locations for our live programs, talks, small-scale lectures, seminars, roundtables, meetings, but also things like toddler groups, weekends, workshops for kids and families, after-school clubs, anything and everything in a way. And as I mentioned, we don't imagine that all of these would be organised in-house, and frankly, because of resources limitations, they really can't be. So we want to act as a platform for other groups, so that in addition to our own programs, we look to support others. And this could simply be by making our spaces available without charge, or it could be in a more collaborative way, where we are working with a group to help develop their ideas, offering curatorial and logistical support. So using our expertise to enable others. And this, in a sense, I think, kind of sums up what the centre is about. It's not a repository of knowledge in the way that we might imagine museums to be traditionally, but a place where knowledge is shared and exchanged. On our website, like many museums or similar institutions, we have a link, a top-level link that says learn or learning. And of course, facilitating learning is really fundamental to what we do. In the museum world, in my relatively short career still, I remember how that terminology actually shifted from education, which in this context seems somehow sort of didactic or top-down, to learning, which seems a little bit more self-directed. But the direction of the transfer of knowledge it implies is still one way, from institution to audience. When in fact, at the core of the Farrell Centre is the idea that the urban room, for the urban room and for architecture and planning to legitimately claim to address the public or somehow be for the public good, the public needs a voice inside those disciplines one way or another. And that's really what the Farrell Centre is aiming to achieve. So this all leads on to a question that I know a lot of people might be asking: where's the city model? I haven't mentioned it yet. Well, there is a model that exists that's actually held by Newcastle City Council. It's decades old and has been added to over the years as new buildings have been constructed. And lastly, that's been superseded by a digital model. And there are a number of challenges around that. Firstly, the physical model, at least, is only Newcastle. It sort of assumes that Gateshead doesn't exist, which is obviously problematic. And the reason for that is because it relates to local authority demarcations. And secondly, city models more generally are necessarily big and as a result expensive. So I made a decision early on that we didn't really have the money or the resources to properly do justice a city model. And thirdly, I think, certainly personally, have reservations about the efficacy in engaging people, the efficacy of models in engaging people with architecture and planning. There's a wow factor for sure of large scale models, and being able to find one's home on it is always fun. But the concentration on urban form, I think, is a risk of being detrimental to the social, cultural, material implications of development, whether this is the effects on traffic, for instance, of a new building, or the pressure of local schools from a new housing development or other local amenities, to something as abstract but as important as the carbon footprints of new development. All of this is, I always think, much more important than a building's presence in the skyline, although obviously the two things are related. And I appreciate this may be a contentious point, so I'm looking forward to discussing this afterwards. But I should point out that we won't be banishing the model entirely, but are working on approaches for how it might be something that is manifested in a way that's not monolithic, that might be dynamic rather than fixed, and which is inherently collaborative and geared to young people in particular. So I'm not going to give anything away, just watch this space. And then just to kind of draw things to a close, we finally get to the third floor. And we've had this gradual transition from the wholly public space that conceptually, at least, I want us to think of as continuous with the city on the ground floor, to the private space now of the third floor. Because here in the attic, we're creating a series of studio spaces accommodating around 25 people. And we'll be working with the university's careers department to develop an incubator for startup companies working in the built environment, and that will be broadly defined. There'll be careers support and rent scaling from 0 in the first year to market rent in year 3, at which point the fledgling companies can be sort of set aflight in the city. So we're conscious, obviously, that the Farrell Centre, as I've kind of talked about in several ways, is trying to kind of affect change by engaging the public and thinking about it in crude sense, that in the kind of the demand side, but it also requires change on the supply side too. And this is what we're trying to achieve with the incubator. And the intention is that while this is private space up here, these are studio spaces, places of work, that the culture that exists within them permeates down through the rest of the centre. These will be places of display. The centre will be somewhere where things are displayed, a place of discourse in the widest possible sense, and also in these spaces, a place of practice too. So I want to conclude by just returning to that notion of hybridity, because I think it's really important to how the centre is constituted. It's there, we're part of the university, but we also have a kind of independent identity. But it's also core, as I've hopefully articulated, about how we operate as a platform for others whose missions intersect with our own. The idea that to be a truly public institution, our audience needs to reflect the public as a whole, presenting a kind of a parity between our programs. So not putting all our eggs in one basket, but putting them in many different ones, connecting the local to the global, and then introducing a public voice into professional debates. And then finally, that point I just mentioned, by affecting change by engaging the public, but also offering opportunities for new ways of practicing. So at the heart of this is a democratic mission, and it's the belief that the best way to affect positive, meaningful change in the built environment is to engage and empower people. And this is about transforming a latent interest in architecture and planning into an explicit one, so that people feel able to get involved in shaping the future of their city. And this is really what I mean when, in the past I've talked about the Farrell Centre as a kind of activist institution. It's not a case of leading, but of showing the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Owen. That was really absorbing, engrossing. It sounds so very exciting and a fantastic resource, a place of really active learning, as you say, as distinct from the repository, and one that really obviously realizes in physical form and spirit Sir Terry Farrell's vision for an urban room, and also then builds on it. I love the idea of an interactive city model as well. And even without having heard you or read your script for tonight, earlier on, I was thinking just how critical it was that it promotes democratic design with citizens as interlocutors, and also curators, referring to your open call for them to propose all kinds of artifacts with stories attached to them of personal significance. Newcastle is such an intriguing city, experientially amazing, dramatic, topologically. Also, great change has taken place in the city centre. And like so many, looking back, its post-war heritage came about without public consultation. So, the question would be, will the Farrell Centre be a trailblazer in breaking down boundaries and silos, preventing citizens from playing active roles in shaping their everyday places. I do really think that it's vital to challenge conventional curatorial practice in this area. So I've got, what we'll do now is I've got two questions, which Owen's already got from me, so he's prepared his answers. And in the meantime, if any of you would like to put a question directly to Owen, please put it in the chat box and we'll engage with it. We'll engage with them shortly. So Owen, just thinking very topically, and because I am myself very concerned with the social impact of architecture and planning, two things the government's new levelling up white paper do are to put well-being, health, social fabric and community relationships on an equal footing with economic measures, and they give steps also, it gives steps towards devolution a higher priority. So at this point, it appears to be more of a manifesto, one rather than one full of policies. How do you plan to engage local citizens with architecture and planning in both the city and the region in ways that can enable real action on the ground? You've talked an awful lot about all the different strategies, but real action on the ground, I mean, that's a tough call, isn't it? What would you say in response to that?
I'd say that's the fundamental question
yeah.
in many ways. And you know, in a lot of the work that's sort of the backdrop to that talk is thinking about vision and strategy and measures of success for the centre. And you know, there are, which is probably my way of answering your question, but there are kind of crude ones of how many people we get through the door, how many people we engage online, all those kinds of things. But in terms of those broader aspirations and how you describe how we can help enable people to affect meaningful change, it's almost impossible to quantify, to trace somehow a development that is better than it would have been otherwise to anything that we've done. I mean, I think ultimately what we're trying to do is to, as I described at the end of the talk, to transform the sort of what I've described as a sort of latent interest in architecture and planning. I think everyone, I'm sure, is interested in you know, the building that's going up at the end of the road and what the effects it will be on parking, for instance, or of the new supermarket that's going in on a site outside the city centre, or the new tower that's proposed on the quayside. But don't think of it, that interest, in terms of architecture with a capital A or planning with a capital P, and therefore perhaps either lack the I guess the language to be able to assess it in those terms in a way that is needed to actively get involved in those processes, or perhaps simply lack the confidence to do so. And you know, the Farrell Centre, our mission is to ensure that people are able to make that leap from this latent to a kind of more explicit interest, and to have the confidence to get involved. I think ultimately, I believe it's for people to decide what they want to do with that, whether, you know, it's, maybe everyone is all in favor of things that I personally might disagree with, but that's not my call. Ultimately, it's about trusting people and enabling people to get involved and to play an active role in shaping where they live. And I'm confident that out of that will yield better places, a better city.
Fantastic. That's really just what I hoped you would say. So on the Farrell Centre website, which already advertises the activities that you're doing online and various other initiatives until you open as a physical centre, you've got a text where you say the following, and I think you're totally right, that we need an architecture that's diverse, pluralist, and sustains multiple conversations about the active role architects and planners might play in the world. And this is actually one of the reasons I brought my exhibition 6 years ago, Urbanistas, Women Innovators in Architecture, Urban and Landscape Design, to the core in Newcastle, supported by Northern Architecture and Igloo Regeneration, and invited Chi Onura, the Labour MP for Newcastle upon Tynes Centre, to join one of our roundtables. She's a woman engineer and a supporter of lifelong education, lifelong learning. So at a time when so much of life and the sustainability of the world is being rethought, tell us how the Farrell Centre is reevaluating architectural history, and you are an architectural historian, and also cultural history more widely, and communicating messages about the value of diverse lived experiences as a creative driver for architecture and planning.
It's a really it's a really pertinent and really big question, and here the Farrell Centre is uniquely placed because we are part of a university. We are, I'm currently at my office in the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, and there's obviously we have the closest and most obvious connection to that school, but by no means will our connections and interactions with the broader university be limited to that. And everything you described is currently being worked on by colleagues across the university. So the Farrell Centre will draw from that, benefits from this extraordinary research culture and research resource, where there are people answering or maybe not answering is the right word, but are tackling the questions about those fundamental questions about how we reevaluate architectural, cultural history, how we think about how we've ended up where we are right now, and the sort of the historical context for present realities. That work is being undertaken urgently across the universities, in the country and the world. And we are, as I say, uniquely placed as a small fledgling cultural venue, public space, to act as a way of making that very public. And certainly our role is in part as a public interface, connecting university and research that takes place within it to a public audience. And in the way I described about the need for the public to have a voice within debates would otherwise be internal to planning, to architecture and planning, we are a way for public perspectives to find a place within university itself. So I'm not sure I've necessarily answered your question other than to say that I think the way of answering it is through our position as part of the university, but as overtly public facing at the same time.
Fantastic. Small centre, big impact then.
I hope so.
Yeah. I mean, you describe of the fruitful interfaces with urgently needed work being taking place across the whole of the university. So what do you see emerging perhaps from future collaborations with the universities, the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape, because it's got research and teaching spanning multidisciplinary creative practice, social sciences, humanities and biotechnologies within its bounds, never mind the rest of the university's faculties. There seems to be a kind of multiplier effect that could be set in motion here.
Oh, absolutely. There's no shortage of extraordinary work being done. You mentioned the lecture series that is currently running, and without wishing to give it a plug, but just last night we had one of my colleagues speaking as part of it. It is intended as a platform for a broad range of voices, but we had a home team representative last night, Professor Ruth Morrow, who is Professor of Biological Architecture and is one of the leaders of the Hub for Biotechnology in the Built Environment, who is doing the most extraordinary work with biomaterials and how they might be used in I guess new not just kind of new forms of building, but new kind of almost new ways of thinking about architecture. And her argument was partly about the sort of the what these materials offer, but also about how her, and I'm no doubt mangling her extremely elegant argument, but about the role of collaboration and the possibilities of the conversations that one has and the relationships and networks that one establishes that are inherently interdisciplinary, that take place both within university, within academia more broadly, but also with end users, people, but with industry. Mm-hmm. And the way that actually in a funny sense, the outcomes of these projects is not just these new materials, which may or may not have real world applications, but new ways of thinking about collaboration, which are themselves transformative and allow us to think about architecture and planning and what they do in potentially wholly new ways. So that's just kind of one example of the way that these opportunities, and I think what we don't want to do, although we could do quite easily, is kind of just simply act as a working things that are happening public. A bodywork has been produced, let's put it on display. We may well do that from time to time, but I'm interested in what can be generated by working together. So what possibilities emerge from inserting the Farrell Centre and its sort of public agenda into these research projects that are taking place. So it's not the add-on at the end to say we've had public impact on our project, but actually that is part of the very conception of the research project, whether that's in APL or more broadly. I don't think it really matters.
Yeah, as an integrated phenomenon as well. So that it could have unforeseen positive impacts on industries. The construction industry, for example. So I think we have now, very fortunately, we've got some few questions and comments, which I'm just waiting to pop up here in the box. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for them, Owen, I've got another question for you. So this is a quickie, really, after the gravitas of the first one. So what's your favourite place or building in Newcastle, apart from the Farrell Centre, of course?
Oh, blimey. That's a really good question, but it's put me on the spot a bit. Um, my favorite, I think my favorite place in Newcastle. I mean, I'm going to choose a really obvious one. It's the Ousebourne Valley. Ousebourne is a tributary of the Tyne.
Mm.
It flows. Um, there's a park or series of parks that are around it. Heaton Park, where there's over the road from where we are, Jesmond Dean. And it's this kind of amazing, almost sort of oasis in the city. And then the Ousebourne goes into a culvert, and then it reappears under three amazing viaducts, and flows through this former industrial area that's now been reborn as in a kind of familiar way as a sort of creative area. Money is piling in, even though it's radically different to how that happens in London. But money is certainly piling in. But it still has this kind of amazing, slight sort of backwater quality to it. And at the very end is the free trade in pub, which I imagine most people who know Newcastle are aware of that pub, and it has the most, as well as doing amazing beer. There's a local really good craft brewing scene. There's a concentration of, I think, 7 or 8 breweries in that vicinity in the Ousebourne. It has this most amazing view, looking back at the Tyne and this kind of the succession of bridges that is the most iconic view of Tyneside I think one could have. And that's a very special place, I think.
I totally agree with you. I really enjoyed going there, and apart from that wonderful pub, yes. So it's the Ashtacular Igloo Regeneration Project. Really full of. I mean, the potential was there when I went. What was it, 6 years ago? So we have now got the questions and comments through. So Lara Kinnear has asked you, if all goes to plan, what would you like to see happening at the Farrell Centre in 10 years and 20 years' time? Will the funding be there for the long term?
Yeah, well, I hope by then I'll have passed the baton on to somebody else.
Really?
I mean, I think, I mean, I'm incredibly lucky, and this was the reason why I was interested in this job, was to be involved in a project at a really early stage and play a key role in defining what this new cultural institution would be like, and no doubt making loads of mistakes with the building project that we will come to regret, but that's the nature of these things. Why didn't I put the plug socket there? All those sorts of questions. But I think it's more broadly about establishing the sort of the ethos of the place that I've kind of talked about, the culture of the place. And I think I'd be very happy for someone, a successor or successors, to do things very differently, but I would still like that ethos to remain. I think there are different ways of meeting our goals, and I think it's be really interesting to see what they are. But I think those goals need to remain consistent. Will funding be there in the long term? Hopefully. We have the advantage, we're part of the university, which provides the kind of bedrock of funding, and certainly we hope, however, down the line that external funding will become part of will contribute meaningfully to what the Farrell Centre does, which I think is not purely about not relying on the university, but I think there's this real positive thing about the Farrell Centre being seen as a collective endeavour in that way.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, apropos of that, I think we when you're further advanced with your plans, we could all benefit greatly if we invited you to come and give us a talk about how things are going in person at the Temple Bar, which might even help you with funding discussions. Who knows? Who knows? Yeah. So Chloe Street's comment is that she really loves the proposal that the urban room is a free-flowing internal public space, because we're so lacking in these types of spaces that don't demand that people actually shell out money and purchase before they enter. Do you want to make a comment on that? We've got another comment after that coming up.
Yes. Well, I'm Chloe. I'm glad you like the idea. I mean, I've been asked, well, does that mean you're going to have sort of like exterior pavers inside? And I thought, wow, that could be quite an interesting idea. I mean, probably not, but there are lots of kind of practical implications of the sort of bold conceptual idea. But I think there are some key moves in the design of particularly that ground floor space and the way it's kind of bookended by these two glass walls, essentially, that hopefully do give a sense of it kind of being continuous with the city, even if some of the practical realities make that harder to achieve. But it's the aspiration, and I think so much of what I've talked about is about aspiration, and it's trying to find ways to meet it.
Yeah, so here we have another comment. I hope this investment from Farrell helps to mobilise a movement to set up the urban room in every large town and city, representing a shift towards a social well-being rather than an economic agenda. And I think a number of commentators have made that point. I completely agree and support that approach. What do you think? And what do you think the scope for doing that is?
Well, yes, I mean, I absolutely. I mean, that was what Terry recommended in the Farrell review, and that's where we've kind of. And
there are now over 12, aren't there? Including, I think Sheffield and Reading are affiliated with universities, and the one in Croydon with the council. So it's already
there are a growing number, and of a very different nature. Some I talked about the example of Sheffield. I mean that will be a very different kind of urban room to the Farrell Centre, even if we are ultimately trying to achieve quite similar things. So I mean, I don't want people to look at the Farrell Centre and think, well, we need to have a university partner, or we need to have that kind of that anchor, because it isn't. It's fundamental to how the Farrell Centre is going to develop, of course, but it doesn't have to be to how urban rooms more broadly develop, and it can. The scale can be very, very different. And I think, as I said, for me, the beauty of the idea is that it is quite vague, and it means you can apply it in so many different ways. And I think, the exciting thing, if the Farrell Centre can act as a kind of spur or catalyst, will be to see the very different ways that the urban room idea is manifested, that are particular to the places, the people who are organising it, the issues that they feel are most important to them.
Absolutely, so that they generate themselves in a very bespoke, locally specific and relevant way. I think, and Chloe Street's other point is that the growing civic university agenda should help inspire other universities to support such initiatives. And of course, as we've said, up till now it's universities and local councils, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that there could, and there are indeed some that are wholly have grown from the grassroots, and could even be grow from community land trusts, for example, which is another phenomenon that we'd like to see more of course, across this country.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Newcastle describes itself as a civic university. It has an engagement and place strategy, which is part of, you know, at the very top of its kind of strategic objectives, a part of the, you know, the grand vision for the whole university. And you know, the Farrell Centre is but a component of this really broad range of work that's taking place at a whole variety of different levels. And you know, it reflects the fact that in Newcastle, you know, just in terms of physical space, Newcastle University takes up an awful lot of the city centre, and so does Northumbria, for instance. And the two universities and the NHS are the biggest single employers in the city. And I think part of this is, you know, we're in the last 40 years, as you know, Newcastle and many other northern cities like it have changed fundamentally. And you know, if there's a vacuum in a sense that has formed in a lot of these places, and a lot of it's been, you know, a lot has been filled. You know, I talk about something like the Quayside and the Farrell Master Plan. I mean, that's been an utterly extraordinary transformation of, you know, dead parts of the city, frankly, into now, you know, a really thriving public space, or publicly accessible space, at least. And I think, you know, if we're talking about things like levelling up, and you know, I haven't looked at the white paper myself, but from what I've read about how it's been reported, you know, it's broad strokes at best. And in terms of how, you know, levelling up might be achieved, I think universities have a decisive, critical role to play in all of this. They are the anchors in so many of these cities, and they are what bring people to those cities, students, but also staff. They are generators of new businesses, of ideas, spin-outs from universities. And I think if levelling up, if I was in charge of levelling up, it would be through universities as well as local authorities, but universities particularly, that I would be looking as key players in making that agenda meaningful.
And in tandem with that, and interdependent with that, the creative industries, of which architecture and the built environment professions are a fundamental, really important part as well. So the ethos, establishing the ethos of the place is a role that has fallen to you, Owen, and we have been really fascinated to listen to what you've had to say. We're going to have to close now. Thank you so much we've run out of time. And as I say, my invitation holds to invite you back later this year to speak in person at Temple Bar, where we'll also live stream at the same time to keep the program running in a hybrid way. So I think it's given us an awful lot to think about, and we will mull over the possibilities in the coming weeks and months. So I would like to flag up the fact that we've got 2 online talks coming up this spring. So on the 24th of February, we've got Femi Oresanya, principal of HOK, who's going to talk about diversity and collaboration, the word that you used in architecture, looking at new pathways into the profession and how through creative collaboration in practice, successful outcomes can be achieved, and looking at projects like HOK's Francis Crick Institute in London. And then on the 17th of March, we have Nikki Gorick, the fine art photographer. She's going to present her exploratory photography of a host of churches across the square mile, St. Paul's Cathedral and more than 40 other Anglican churches, and Jewish and Dutch and Catholic and Welsh places of worship, conveying a pretty vibrant, diverse spiritual life of goings-on and charismatic personalities within London's financial centre. So check the website for sign-up details, and you can watch this entire episode of our talk series on YouTube, which will be on as a tape, as a video recording. If you missed the beginning, we did have a few technical difficulties at the beginning, for which we are very, very sorry, and hope that it didn't impede anybody's enjoyment of the event. But as I say, the entire recording is available imminently online. So Owen, thanks a lot. It's been a tremendous pleasure. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody for joining us. Thank you. And
Thanks for having me.
right. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.